Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're tackling 17th century metaphysics.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, we're going to try to untangle the ideas of some real heavy hitters, Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, and
A
Leibniz.
real philosophical all-star team.
Exactly. Think of it like, a quest to understand reality itself, and each of these guys offering a different piece of the puzzle.
I like that, a quest for reality. Now, where are we getting our clues from for this quest?
Our source material is this really interesting book called The Metaphysicians, and it does a good job, setting the stage.
Okay, set the stage for me.
Well, this period just after the Renaissance was like this time of intense intellectual ferment.
People questioning everything they thought they knew.
Exactly. And these four were like at the forefront of that whole revolution.
So we've got drama, we've got intellectual upheaval. What else makes these thinkers so captivating?
Well, what's really interesting is that they weren't just these abstract theorists, their lives were full of drama, contradictions, even a touch of the absurd.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Absurdity. I'm ready for some philosophical gossip.
Okay, well, let's start with René Descartes. He's the I think, therefore I am guy.
Oh yeah, the OG of modern philosophy.
Right. That phrase has almost become a cliche, but there's some serious depth there, isn't there? What was he getting at with that whole I think, therefore I am?
He was wrestling with a problem that's kept philosophers up at night for, like, centuries.
Mm.
How can we be certain of anything at all?
It's like, how do we know we're not all just brains in a vat or dreaming or...
Exactly. So Descartes went radical. He decided to doubt everything he thought he knew, kind of like a thought experiment.
Okay, so doubt everything. Got it.
And in that process of doubting, he had this breakthrough. He realized that even if he doubted everything, the very act of doubting proved that there was something doing the doubting a thinking self.
So it's like even our doubts can lead us to knowledge.
Exactly. That's the brilliance of his method of doubt. It's not about being skeptical for the sake of it, but about using doubt as a tool to uncover those foundational truths. The ones you just can't shake.
Okay, so doubting led him to that bedrock of certainty, his own thinking self. And from there, he builds up his whole system of knowledge.
Precisely. And that's what makes Descartes so influential. He gave us a new way to think about knowledge, a new starting point.
It's interesting, though. There's a side to Descartes that I find a little puzzling.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What do you mean?
Well, there's this story about a pilot who was transporting him to Stockholm. The pilot described him as a demigod, someone with superhuman knowledge. Like, the pilot was totally in awe of him.
It sounds like Descartes had quite the reputation.
He did, but at the same time, he was apparently terrified of social interaction, like constantly changing his address to avoid people. And he even held back his work on the heliocentric theory because he was afraid of being persecuted, like what happened to Galileo.
That's so fascinating. It's like this incredibly brilliant mind, capable of revolutionizing our understanding of the universe, but struggling with everyday human anxieties.
Exactly. It makes you realize that even the greatest thinkers are still human, with all the complexities and contradictions that come with being human.
It humanizes them in a way. It makes them more relatable, even if their ideas are sometimes way out there.
Totally. So let's delve a little deeper into some of those ideas. We've got to talk about the immaterial soul, right?
Yeah.
Descartes was adamant that the soul was separate and distinct from the body.
Yes, that was a cornerstone of his philosophy, and it had huge implications for how we understand consciousness, the mind-body problem, even the possibility of life after death.
It's an idea that continues to spark debate and fascination, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and it raises all sorts of questions. If the soul is immaterial, how does it interact with the physical body?
Right, that's the mind-body problem in a nutshell. How do these two seemingly different realms, the mental and the physical, connect?
It's a problem that philosophers are still grappling with today. And Descartes' solution, this idea of a separate soul and body, is just one way to approach it.
We also can't forget Descartes' attempts to prove God's existence. But if I recall correctly, those arguments weren't exactly airtight, were they?
No, they weren't. His ontological argument, the idea that God's perfection necessitates his existence, has been heavily criticized for being logically flawed.
So even brilliant minds like Descartes can make mistakes.
Absolutely. No one is infallible, not even the philosophical giants. And what's important is that we engage with their arguments critically, even if they're flawed. It helps us refine our own understanding.
That's a good point. Thinking critically, even about the ideas of great thinkers, is how we learn and grow, right?
Exactly. And it's important to remember that Descartes wasn't just a metaphysician, lost in the realm of abstract ideas. he made really significant contributions to mathematics as well.
Oh, right. Analytical geometry, that was his thing.
Yeah, and it had a lasting impact on both math and science.
Hmm.
It's a good reminder that these different fields of knowledge, they're not as separate as we sometimes think they are.
They're all connected, like pieces of the same puzzle. So from the I think, therefore I am of Descartes, let's move on to another major figure, Nicolas Malebranche. He was a 17th century French philosopher who was really influenced by Descartes, but he kind of took those ideas in some really surprising directions.
Oh, Malebranche is fascinating. He was particularly interested in the mind-body problem. Remember how Descartes said the mind and body are fundamentally different substances?
Right, totally different realms.
Well, Malebranche took that idea and ran with it. He was trying to figure out how these two radically different things, the mind and the body, could possibly interact. How does my immaterial mind cause my physical arm to move, for example? It's a really tricky question.
That's a question that has always baffled me, honestly. How do those two realms interact? It seems so mysterious.
Right. And Malebranche was grappling with that same mystery. He got inspiration from a theory called occasionalism, which had been proposed by another philosopher named Jelinx. Imagine this. Every time your mind wants to do something, like move your arm, God steps in to make it happen.
Wait, so every time I scratch my nose or take a sip of coffee, God is directly intervening to make that happen. Wouldn't that make God incredibly busy?
You're telling me. It does seem like an awful lot of divine micromanaging.
So Malebranche basically said, yep, that's how it works. God is the puppet master of our every action.
Well, not exactly. He actually took this idea of occasionalism and made it even more radical. He argued that we don't even perceive the material world directly at all.
Okay, now you've really lost me. What do you mean we don't perceive the material world directly? Like, I'm looking at this microphone right now. What am I seeing, if not the microphone?
According to Malebranche, what you're seeing is God's idea of the microphone. He believed that we see all things through God. Our ideas are literally God's ideas.
Wow, okay. So, when I look at a tree, I'm actually seeing God's concept of a tree. That is a wild idea.
It is a mind-bending concept, but Malebranche was trying to solve a really deep philosophical problem. If mind and matter are so different, how can they possibly interact?
His solution was certainly creative, I'll give him that. Okay, so we've tackled Descartes, Malebranche. Who's next on our philosophical journey?
Let's dive into the world of Baruch Spinoza. He was a true radical, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom.
I've heard his name. Didn't he get in trouble for his beliefs?
Oh yeah, he was excommunicated from his own Jewish community for his radical ideas. He believed in pantheism, the idea that God is identical with nature.
So not the traditional view of a God separate from creation, but more like God is the totality of everything, the whole universe itself.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a theological idea for Spinoza. It was a whole philosophical system, a way of understanding reality itself.
And wasn't Spinoza also known for his views on free will, or rather the lack thereof?
He was a firm believer in determinism, the idea that everything happens according to necessity. So yeah, he didn't believe in free will as we commonly understand it. He saw our sense of free will as an illusion.
That's a tough one to swallow. It makes you wonder, if we don't have free will, can we really be held responsible for our actions?
It's a question that has haunted philosophers for centuries. But even though Spinoza was a determinist, he wasn't a nihilist. He believed that understanding the nature of reality and accepting our place in it could lead to a kind of freedom.
Okay, so a different kind of freedom, one that comes from understanding and accepting the way things are rather than fighting against them.
Exactly. It's about mastering our own minds and emotions, recognizing our interconnectedness with everything, and finding peace in that.
That's a very different approach to happiness than what we often hear, about chasing desires and striving for external achievements.
It is. Spinoza's ethics were all about aligning ourselves with the natural order of the universe, recognizing that everything is interconnected and unfolds according to necessity. It's a very stoic view in many ways.
And speaking of aligning one's life with one's beliefs, Spinoza didn't exactly chase wealth or status, did he?
Not at all. He lived a simple life, working as a lens grinder, even though he could have pursued positions that would have brought him fame and fortune. But he valued intellectual freedom and ethical living above all else.
Okay, on to our final philosophical superstar for this deep dive, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He was, well, kind of a Renaissance man, a master of many fields, math, science, philosophy, even diplomacy.
A true polymath. Leibniz was an incredible intellect. He even developed calculus independently of Newton, which is just as astounding.
Wow, that's impressive. But he's probably most famous, at least among non-mathematicians, for his idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds, right?
That's the one. Although it's an idea that sparked a lot of debate and even ridicule.
Well, yeah. Look around us. We've got war, poverty, injustice, climate change. How can anyone seriously claim that this is the best possible world?
It definitely seems counterintuitive. But to understand Leibniz, you have to remember the theological dilemma he was trying to address. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why is there so much suffering and imperfection in the world? It's a question that has troubled theologians and philosophers for ages.
So how did Leibniz try to resolve that?
He argued that a perfect God, by definition, must create the best possible world. He believed that evil is really just another word for imperfection, and that any created world would inherently have limitations.
So even though this world might seem pretty messed up at times, according to Leibniz, it's still the best possible version, given those inherent limitations.
Exactly. That was his way of reconciling the idea of a perfect God with the very real imperfections we see all around us.
I can see how that line of reasoning might not sit well with someone who's experiencing real suffering and hardship. It feels a bit, I don't know, dismissive of the pain that people actually go through.
You're right to raise that point. It's one of the criticisms that has been leveled against Leibniz. It's difficult to reconcile his best of all possible worlds idea with the very real suffering that exists in the world.
And to complicate things further, didn't Leibniz also reject the idea of free will? I'm trying to see how that fits into his worldview.
You're hitting on a key issue there. Leibniz was a determinist, believing that everything unfolds according to a preset plan. So if everything is predetermined, how can we be held accountable for our actions, whether good or bad? It's a puzzle, to say the least.
It does seem contradictory. On the one hand, he's saying God created the best possible world, and on the other hand, he's saying we don't really have free will. So are we just puppets in this supposedly perfect cosmic drama?
It's definitely a tension within his philosophy. I think Leibniz was trying to synthesize a lot of different ideas. Traditional religious beliefs, his own philosophical system, the concept of a perfect God, and sometimes those ideas clashed.
So maybe his ideas were more about seeking a kind of intellectual coherence, even if that meant overlooking some of the messier aspects of human experience.
It's possible. But even if we disagree with some of his conclusions, I think it's valuable to understand how he arrived at them. It helps us to refine our own thinking.
Absolutely. Wrestling with these big philosophical questions, even if we don't find easy answers, is how we grow intellectually.
It's a process of discovery, of challenging our assumptions, and of expanding our understanding of the world and ourselves.
Speaking of expanding our understanding, let's delve a little deeper into Leibniz's philosophical system. We've talked about his best of all possible worlds idea and his belief in determinism, but there's a lot more to unpack there.
Oh, definitely. He had a lot to say about the nature of reality, the relationship between mind and matter, the role of God in the universe. And his ideas were often quite complex and challenging, even a bit strange at times.
Well, that's what we're here for, right? To explore these strange and challenging ideas. What were some of the core concepts that shaped Leibniz's view of the universe?
Well, one key idea was his fascination with purpose in nature, what we call teleology. He believed that everything happens for the best, even if we can't always see the bigger picture.
Okay, so he saw purpose woven into the fabric of reality itself.
Exactly. And along with that, he was also really interested in what we call efficient causes, basically the chain reactions of events that lead to a particular outcome.
So he was trying to understand the mechanisms of the universe, how things work on a cause and effect level.
Right. So you have this interesting tension in Leibniz's thinking, this interplay between purpose and mechanism, between a universe governed by design and a universe governed by natural laws.
It's like he was trying to find a way to reconcile those two seemingly opposing views.
Exactly. And that leads us to one of his most famous and perhaps most mind-boggling concepts, monads.
Monads. I've heard the term, but I'll be honest, they always make my head spin a little.
I don't blame you. They're a challenging concept. Leibniz believed that the entire universe is made up of these tiny, fundamental units of reality called monads.
So these infinitesimal building blocks of existence, what are they like? What's their deal?
Well, here's where it gets really wild. Each monad is like a little mirror, reflecting the entire universe from its own unique perspective.
Hold on. Each one of these tiny things contains a reflection of the entire universe.
That was Leibniz's idea.
Yeah.
It might sound crazy, but it was his way of explaining the interconnectedness of all things. He believed that every single monad, from the smallest to the largest, is linked to every other monad in this grand harmonious system, orchestrated by God.
So it's like this intricate cosmic web with each monad playing its part in this grand symphony of existence.
Exactly. And he called this interconnected system pre-established harmony. It's the idea that God created the universe in such a way that all these monads, even though they don't directly interact with each other, are perfectly synchronized.
Okay, my brain is definitely doing some gymnastics here. So if each monad has its own unique perspective on the universe, does that mean they're like conscious? Are they little mini minds?
It's a great question. And it depends on the type of monad. Leibniz distinguished between what he called bare monads and those with higher levels of awareness. The bare monads, which he thought made up inorganic matter, have a very basic, unconscious perception of the world.
Okay, so the fundamental building blocks of matter, perceiving the universe in a way we can't even fathom.
Exactly. And then as you move up the hierarchy of monads, you get to those with more complex and conscious perception, like animal souls and, of course, human souls. These monads have a more active role, coordinating the activities of the bare monads that make up their bodies.
So our bodies are essentially collections of these bare monads, and our soul, which is also a monad but with a higher level of awareness, is orchestrating the whole show.
That's a pretty good summary of Leibniz's view.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very different way of thinking about the mind-body connection than the strict separation that Descartes proposed.
It is. It's more of an integrated, holistic system where everything is interconnected.
Exactly. And that pre-established harmony idea, that was Leibniz's attempt to explain how these monads, which are essentially windowless, they don't directly communicate to each other, can still interact and influence one another.
So it's like a giant, perfectly synchronized clockwork universe where every gear, every spring, every tiny part is moving in perfect harmony with every other part, even though they're not directly connected.
That's a great analogy. It's like this cosmic symphony orchestrated by God with every note, every instrument playing its part in perfect timing.
It's a beautiful image, but I have to admit it's still a lot to wrap my head around.
I know, it's mind-bending stuff.
Yeah.
But even if we accept this whole system, this idea of pre-established harmony, it still leaves us with some pretty big questions. What about free will? What about the problem of evil? And how can we be sure that any of this is actually true?
Right. How do we know that we're not just monads trapped in our own little subjective worlds with no access to the real reality?
Those are the really deep questions, the ones that keep philosophers up at night. And that's what makes this whole exploration so fascinating. We're trying to understand the nature of reality, the nature of ourselves, but we're always limited by our own perspectives, our own ways of knowing.
It's almost like we're trying to grasp something that's just beyond our reach. We get glimpses, but the full picture remains elusive.
Maybe that's the nature of the quest itself. It's not necessarily about finding all the answers, but about asking the right questions and enjoying the journey of exploration.
Okay, so we've explored the ideas of these four amazing thinkers, Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, all trying to figure out what reality is, what God is like, how the mind and body are connected. We've seen a lot of different approaches, a lot of different solutions, but one thing they all have in common is that they were asking those really big, fundamental questions.
They are the pioneers of modern philosophy, mapping out the terrain of human thought. And their ideas continue to resonate today, even if we don't always agree with them.
And that's what makes studying philosophy so rewarding, right? It's not just about learning facts or memorizing theories. It's about grappling with these big questions, about challenging our own assumptions, and about expanding our understanding of the universe and our place within it.
Exactly. It's an ongoing conversation, a quest for knowledge that has been going on for centuries.
And we get to be part of that conversation.
Exactly. We get to build upon the work of those who came before us, to question, to challenge, and to offer our own perspectives.
So now that we've explored the metaphysical landscape of these four 17th century giants, let's shift gears a bit and venture into the realm of epistemology, the study of knowledge itself.
We're going meta. We're not just asking what we know, but how we know it. What are the limits of human understanding? What are the foundations of our beliefs about the world? How do we know anything at all?
It's like we're taking a deep dive into the mechanics of our own minds. How does this incredible machine called consciousness work? How do we acquire knowledge? What are the sources of our beliefs? These are the questions that drive epistemology.
And to guide us on this journey into the heart of knowledge, we'll be turning to four more philosophical heavyweights: Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and Kant.
Get ready, folks. We're about to go deep into the world of epistemology. Fasten your philosophical seatbelts because it's going to be a wild ride. Let's start with John Locke, a champion of empiricism. He argued that knowledge comes primarily from experience. What were some of his key insights that really shaped the course of epistemology?
Locke laid the groundwork for how we think about knowledge today. He took that same method of doubt that Descartes used and applied it to the question of how we acquire knowledge. One of his most influential ideas, and a really radical one for his time, was his rejection of innate ideas.
Innate ideas. So the notion that we're born with certain types of knowledge pre-programmed into our minds.
Exactly. Locke argued against that. He believed that our minds are essentially blank slates at birth, what he called tabula rasa.
So no preloaded software, just raw processing power ready to be shaped by our experiences.
Exactly. He believed that all our knowledge, even the most complex and abstract ideas, ultimately comes from sensory experience and our reflection on those experiences.
It makes sense when you think about how we learn. We explore the world, we experiment, we make connections. Babies aren't born knowing about gravity or fairness. They learn those things through experience.
Exactly. Locke meticulously argued against the innateness of all sorts of ideas, especially those big philosophical concepts like God, morality, even mathematical principles. He pointed out that these ideas vary widely across cultures, and that even those that seem universal are often the result of social conditioning and education, not some kind of inborn knowledge.
Okay, so if we're not born with these ideas pre-installed, where do they come from? How do we go from experiencing the world through our senses to developing these complex systems of knowledge and belief?
Well, according to Locke, our minds are incredibly powerful processing machines. We take in all this raw sensory data, colors, shapes, sounds, textures, and through processes of comparison, combination, and abstraction, we form ideas. It's like our minds are constantly working to create order out of the chaos of experience.
So it's not just about passively absorbing information, it's about actively shaping and organizing it into something meaningful.
Precisely. Our minds are doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work to make sense of the world.
And Locke called this process of making sense of the world reflection, right?
Yes, it's the ability of our minds to turn inward, to examine our own ideas, compare them, combine them, and generate new, more complex ideas. It's this never-ending process of mental construction.
It's like we're constantly building and rebuilding our understanding of the world.
That's a great way to put it. But even though Locke was a champion of this idea of knowledge coming from experience, he ran into some challenges when it came to explaining certain fundamental concepts.
Like what? Where did his empirical framework hit a snag?
Well, for example, he struggled with the idea of substance. If all our knowledge comes from experience, how do we account for this underlying something, this stuff that our senses are supposedly detecting? What is that stuff of reality?
It's like, okay, we see colors and shapes and textures, but what is it that's actually there underneath it all?
That was the question that troubled Locke. He admitted that the concept of substance was ultimately mysterious. He could describe its qualities, how it appeared to us, but he couldn't get at its essence. He was limited by the framework he had established.
So even the father of empiricism had to admit there were some things that remained beyond the grasp of our senses and our reasoning.
Exactly, and that's where things get really interesting because Locke's struggles with substance opened the door for his successors, like George Berkeley, to really push those skeptical boundaries.
And that brings us to Berkeley, the philosopher who famously declared to be is to be perceived. Now that's a statement that can really shake things up.
Berkeley was a fascinating thinker. He was an Irish bishop with a sharp mind, and he had this knack for taking philosophical ideas and turning them upside down. He took Locke's empiricism and, well, he radicalized it, leading to this theory known as subjective idealism.
Subjective idealism. Okay, break that down for me. Is this the idea that reality is all in our heads?
You're on the right track. Berkeley argued that the only things that truly exist are minds and the ideas they perceive. There's no such thing as a mind-independent material world, according to his view.
Whoa, so are you saying that this table, these microphones, everything around us, they don't actually exist? Is it all just an illusion?
Not an illusion exactly, but more like a mental construct. Berkeley's argument was that what we perceive as the material world is actually a collection of ideas, and those ideas exist only in our minds.
Okay, I'm gonna need a little help with this one. So if I close my eyes, does this whole studio just poof into nothingness?
Berkeley would say that it would cease to exist for you, but not necessarily for other minds that might still be perceiving it. And to address the issue of why the world seems so consistent, even when we're not looking at it, Berkeley offered a theological explanation.
Okay, I'm all ears. How did he explain that?
He believed that God, the infinite mind, is constantly perceiving everything. So even when we close our eyes, God's perception keeps the world running, so to speak.
So God is the ultimate observer, the one who guarantees the stability of reality.
You got it. It's important to note that Berkeley wasn't saying that our everyday experience of the world is wrong, you know. He acknowledged that things appear solid and real to us. His point was that the underlying nature of reality is mental, grounded in perception.
Okay, so to exist is to be perceived either by our minds or by the mind of God. It's a very different way of thinking about the nature of reality.
It's a radical shift in perspective and raises all sorts of questions about objectivity. If everything is ultimately perceived through individual minds, can there be such a thing as a truly objective view of the world?
That's a great question. And it's a question that was taken up by our next philosophical giant, David Hume. He's often considered the most radical of the British empiricists, pushing skepticism to its logical limits.
Hume was a master of skepticism. He really wanted to understand the boundaries of human knowledge, what we can and cannot know for sure.
And he's famous for being skeptical about some pretty fundamental concepts, like the idea of cause and effect.
Oh, absolutely. Hume took those ideas of Locke and Berkeley about experience and pushed them to their logical conclusions. He argued that all our knowledge is based on impressions, those vivid sensory experiences and ideas, which are basically fainter copies of those impressions.
Okay, so we start with sensory impressions and build our knowledge from there.
Right. But then Hume asked this really tough question. How can we go from those individual, fleeting impressions to making generalizations about the world? How can we be certain that the future will resemble the past? How can we prove that one event actually causes another?
It's like that classic example of the sun rising every morning. Just because it's happened every day of our lives doesn't guarantee it'll happen again tomorrow, right?
Exactly. And Hume's point was that there's no logical necessity connecting cause and effect. We observe things happening together, but we can't be absolutely certain that one event actually causes the other. It's more about habit and custom than any kind of provable causal link. We just get used to seeing things happen in a particular sequence.
So our minds create these connections based on repeated experience, but there's always a possibility that those connections could be wrong.
That was Hume's radical insight, and it had major implications for how we think about science and knowledge in general. If we can't be certain about cause and effect, then how reliable are scientific laws, which are often based on these supposed causal relationships?
It's a bit unsettling, to say the least. It makes you wonder if we're building our whole understanding of the world on a foundation of assumptions and habits rather than solid proof.
That was the challenge that Hume threw down. He didn't have a solution, but he wanted us to be aware of the limits of human reason, of the fact that our knowledge might be more provisional and less certain than we often assume. And his work had a huge impact on subsequent thinkers, especially Immanuel Kant, who tried to find a way to reconcile Hume's skepticism with the apparent certainty of things like mathematics and science.
And so we arrive at the summit of our epistemological mountain, Immanuel Kant. He's widely considered one of the most influential philosophers of all time, and he had some very specific ideas about how we acquire knowledge. I have to admit, I find Kant a bit daunting, but also incredibly fascinating.
Kant is definitely a challenging thinker, but his work is absolutely essential for understanding modern philosophy. He was deeply troubled by Hume's skepticism, but he also recognized the power and achievements of science. So he set out to find a way to account for both the limits of human reason and the apparent certainty of scientific knowledge.
Okay, so how did he attempt to pull off that philosophical magic trick? How do you reconcile those two seemingly contradictory ideas?
Well, his solution was truly revolutionary. He proposed that the world we experience is not simply a reflection of some mind-independent reality, but rather it's a product of our minds actively shaping and structuring our perceptions. He called this a Copernican revolution in philosophy.
So it's our minds aren't just passively receiving information, they're actively constructing the world we experience.
Precisely. Kant argued that our minds come pre-equipped with certain innate categories of understanding, things like space, time, and causality. These categories aren't derived from experience. They're the preconditions for having any experience at all. They're the mental lenses, so to speak, through which we filter and organize all that raw sensory data that's coming in.
So instead of the world imposing its structure on our minds, it's the other way around. Our minds are imposing structure on the world.
Exactly. It's a powerful idea, but it has huge implications for how we think about knowledge and reality. For Kant, we can never truly know the world in itself, what he called the noumenal realm. All we have access to is the phenomenal realm, the world as it appears to us, already filtered and shaped by those mental categories.
So it's like we're each living in our own custom-built virtual reality.
It's a good analogy. But Kant wasn't saying the external world doesn't exist. He was saying our understanding of it will always be limited by how our minds are structured.
That's a pretty humbling thought, to realize there might be so much more to reality than we can even grasp.
It is humbling, but it's also kind of exciting, right? Because it means there's always more to discover, more to learn, more to explore.
It reminds me of that quote by Einstein: "The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science."
Absolutely. That sense of wonder, of mystery, it's what drives us to keep searching, to keep asking those big questions.
Okay, so we've explored the ideas of these four incredible thinkers: Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Each of them, in their own way, was trying to grapple with these huge questions about existence, about the nature of reality, the mind-body problem, the existence of God, the problem of evil, the meaning of life.
And what's so striking is how each of them, while building on the work of those who came before, offered radically different ways of understanding the world.
It's like they were all given the same philosophical puzzle but came up with completely different solutions.
Exactly. And even though some of their ideas might seem strange or even a bit out there to us today, they were all wrestling with these fundamental questions that still resonate with us centuries later.
It makes you realize these weren't just abstract theories for them, but real attempts to make sense of the universe and our place in it.
Absolutely. And they weren't just detached thinkers either. Their lives were intertwined with the events and upheavals of their time. Descartes fleeing religious persecution, Malebranche seeking solace in a contemplative life, Spinoza facing excommunication, Leibniz navigating those complex political landscapes.
It reminds us that these were real people with real lives, grappling with these huge questions in the context of their own experiences.
And that's what makes studying philosophy so enriching, I think. It's not just about memorizing arguments or theories, but about connecting with these brilliant minds across time and space, engaging with their ideas, and seeing how they might inform our own understanding of the world.
It's about joining that ongoing conversation, that quest for knowledge that has been happening for centuries. So we've explored the metaphysical landscape pretty thoroughly, but our philosophical journey doesn't end there. Now we're going to shift gears a bit and dive into the realm of epistemology, the study of knowledge itself.
We're going meta. We're not just asking what we know, but how we know it. How do we acquire knowledge? What are the limits of human understanding? What are the foundations for our beliefs about the world? How do we know anything at all?
It's like taking a deep dive into the mechanics of our own minds. How does this incredible machine we call consciousness work? How do we take in information, process it, and turn it into knowledge?
Precisely. It's a fascinating area of inquiry. And to guide us on this exploration into the nature of knowledge, we'll be turning to four more philosophical giants: Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and Kant.
Buckle up, everyone. We're about to enter the world of epistemology. It might get a little bumpy, but I promise it'll be worth the ride.
I'm ready for the ride.
Great. Let's start with John Locke, a champion of empiricism. He believed that knowledge comes primarily from experience. What were some of his key insights that helped to shape the course of epistemology?
Locke really set the stage for modern epistemology. He took that same method of doubt that Descartes championed and applied it to the question of how we acquire knowledge.
So he's building on that foundation of skepticism, that idea that we can't just take things for granted.
Exactly. And one of Locke's most influential and revolutionary ideas for his time was his rejection of innate ideas.
Innate ideas. So the notion that we're born with certain types of knowledge already hardwired into our brains?
Exactly. Locke argued against that. He believed our minds are essentially blank slates at birth, what he called tabula rasa. No preloaded software, so to speak, just raw processing power waiting to be shaped by experience.
So everything we know, everything we believe, is ultimately derived from our interactions with the world.
That was Locke's fundamental insight. He believed that all knowledge, even the most complex and abstract ideas, ultimately stems from sensory experience and our reflection on those experiences.
So it's not just about passively taking in information. It's about actively making sense of it, connecting the dots, and building up a coherent picture of the world based on our experiences.
Right. Our minds are incredibly active in that process. It's not just about sensory input, it's about how we process and organize that input.
And Locke called that process reflection, didn't he?
He did. It's that ability of our minds to turn inward, to examine our own ideas, to compare and combine them, and to generate new, more complex ideas. It's a constant process of mental construction.
We start with those basic building blocks of experience and, through reflection, build more and more elaborate structures of understanding.
That's a great way to put it. But even though Locke was a strong advocate for empiricism, this idea that knowledge comes from experience, he ran into some challenges when it came to explaining certain foundational concepts.
What kinds of concepts? Where did his empirical framework hit a roadblock?
Well, he struggled with the idea of substance, for example. If all our knowledge comes from experience, how do we account for this underlying something, this stuff that our senses are supposedly detecting? What is that stuff of reality, that underlying substance?
It's a fundamental question, isn't it? We perceive colors, shapes, textures, but what is it that's actually there, the thing in itself? What is it that possesses those qualities?
That was the challenge for Locke. He could describe the qualities, the appearance of things, but he couldn't get at their essence, at the nature of the substance itself. He was, in a way, trapped by the limitations of his own empirical framework.
So even the father of empiricism had to acknowledge that there were some things that remain beyond the reach of our senses and our reasoning.
Exactly. And that's what makes this journey through epistemology so fascinating. Locke's struggles with substance, with the limits of empirical knowledge, paved the way for his successors to explore new avenues of thought, to push the boundaries of skepticism even further.
And that brings us to George Berkeley, the philosopher who famously proclaimed, "To be is to be perceived." It's a mind-blowing statement, isn't it?
It is. Berkeley was a fascinating figure, an Irish bishop with a sharp intellect, and he had this knack for turning philosophical ideas on their heads. He took Locke's empiricism and, well, he radicalized it, leading to a theory known as subjective idealism.
Subjective idealism. Okay, I'm intrigued. Is this where we get that idea that reality is all in our heads?
You're getting warm. Berkeley argued that the only things that truly exist are minds and the ideas they perceive. There's no mind-independent material world, according to his view.
Hold on a second. So you're saying that this table, this microphone, everything around us doesn't actually exist?
Yeah.
That it's all just an illusion?
Not an illusion, exactly, but more like a mental construct. Berkeley was arguing that what we perceive as the material world is actually a collection of ideas, and those ideas, he believed, exist only in our minds.
Okay, I think I'm going to need a bigger whiteboard for this one. So if I close my eyes, does this entire studio just vanish into thin air?
Berkeley would say that it would cease to exist for you, but not necessarily for other minds that might still be perceiving it. And to address the issue of why the world seems so consistent, even when we're not looking at it, Berkeley proposed a theological explanation.
A theological explanation. Okay, now I'm really curious. What did he say?
He argued that God, the infinite mind, is constantly perceiving everything. So even when we close our eyes, God's perception keeps the world running, so to speak. God is the ultimate observer, ensuring the continuity and stability of the world.
So even when a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, God is there to perceive it, so it still makes a sound, at least in God's mind.
Exactly. And it's worth emphasizing that Berkeley wasn't trying to say our everyday experience of the world is wrong. He acknowledged that things appear solid and real to us. His point was that the underlying nature of reality is mental, grounded in perception.
To be is to be perceived. It's a bold statement for sure.
And it raises all sorts of questions. If everything is ultimately perceived through individual minds, can there be such a thing as a truly objective view of the world? What is the nature of truth? How do we know what we know?
Those are some big questions, and it's questions like those that really got David Hume thinking. He's often regarded as the most radical of the British empiricists, someone who really pushed the boundaries of skepticism.
Hume was a master of skepticism. He is fascinated by the limits of human knowledge, by what we can and cannot know for certain.
And from what I recall, he was especially skeptical about some of our most basic assumptions about knowledge, things like the idea of cause and effect.
You're right. He took those ideas of Locke and Berkeley about experience and pushed them to their logical conclusions. He argued that all our knowledge is based on impressions, which are those vivid sensory experiences, and ideas, which are basically fainter copies of those impressions.
Okay, so we start with impressions, the raw data of our senses, and build our knowledge from there.
Right. But then Hume asked this really challenging question. How do we go from those individual fleeting impressions to making generalizations about the world? How can we be certain that the future will resemble the past? How can we prove that one event actually causes another?
It makes you question some pretty fundamental assumptions, like just because the sun has risen every day of our lives, does that logically guarantee it'll rise again tomorrow?
You're getting at the heart of Hume's argument. He said there's no logical necessity connecting cause and effect. We observe things happening together, but we can't be absolutely certain that one event causes the other. It might just be habit and custom, our minds getting used to seeing things happen in a certain sequence.
So, our understanding of cause and effect, one of the cornerstones of scientific thinking, might be based more on habit than on any kind of provable, necessary connection.
That was Hume's radical suggestion, and it had big implications for how we think about science and knowledge in general. If we can't be certain about cause and effect, how reliable are our scientific laws, which are often based on these supposed causal relationships?
It's a pretty unsettling thought to think that our entire understanding of the world might be built on a foundation of assumptions and habits, rather than on rock-solid proof.
That was the challenge that Hume threw down to the philosophical world. He didn't have a solution, but he wanted us to be aware of those limits, to recognize that our knowledge is perhaps more provisional and less certain than we like to think. And his work had a huge impact, especially on Immanuel Kant, who tried to find a way to reconcile Hume's skepticism with the apparent certainty of things like mathematics and science.
Ah, yes, Immanuel Kant, the philosophical giant, the synthesizer of rationalism and empiricism, the author of critiques that still make philosophy students tremble.
He was a formidable thinker, that's for sure. Kant was deeply troubled by Hume's skepticism, but he also saw the undeniable power and achievements of science. So he set out to find a way to account for both. The limits of human reason, as pointed out by Hume, and the apparent certainty of scientific knowledge.
That sounds like a pretty ambitious philosophical project. How did he manage to pull off that balancing act?
Well, he did it by proposing a truly revolutionary idea, that the world we experience is not simply a reflection of some mind-independent reality, but is in fact a product of our minds actively shaping and structuring our perceptions. He called this a Copernican revolution in philosophy.
Okay, so instead of our minds passively receiving information from the world, they're actively constructing the world we experience. That's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. Kant argued that our minds come pre-equipped with certain innate categories of understanding, like space, time, and causality. These categories aren't learned through experience, but are preconditions for having any experience at all.
It's like our minds are wearing these special glasses, these conceptual lenses that shape how we see everything.
That's a good analogy. And according to Kant, because our minds are shaping our perceptions in this way, we can never truly know the world in itself, what he called the noumenal realm. All we have access to is the phenomenal realm, the world as it appears to us, filtered through those mental categories.
It's like we're each living in our own custom-built virtual reality, shaped by the structure of our minds.
It is a mind-bending idea. But Kant wasn't denying the reality of an external world. He was saying that our understanding of that world will always be limited by how our minds are structured.
It's a humbling thought to realize that there might be so much more to reality than we can even grasp.
It is humbling,
Yeah.
but it's also pretty exciting, right? It means there's always more to discover, more to learn, more to explore.
It's that sense of wonder, of mystery, that keeps us asking those big questions and searching for deeper understanding.
Absolutely. It's what drives us to keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge and exploring the vastness of the universe and the intricacies of the human mind.
So, if I understand Kant correctly, he's saying that while our minds are actively shaping our perceptions, those shaping mechanisms, those categories of understanding, are universal, shared by all rational beings. And that shared structure, that common ground, is what makes objective knowledge, and especially scientific knowledge, possible.
That's a great summary. It's like we're all running the same mental software, even though the data we're processing is unique to our individual experiences.
We're all playing the same game, but with different controllers.
Exactly. And those shared rules of the game, that common operating system, are what allow us to communicate, to build shared knowledge, and to agree on certain truths about the world.
It's like a cosmic dance, where each of us has our own unique steps, but we're all moving to the same underlying rhythm.
I like that image. It captures the sense of both individuality and shared experience that Kant was trying to articulate.
Okay, let's step back for a moment and consider the ground we've covered in this deep dive. We've explored the ideas of Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and now Kant. 8 incredible thinkers, each grappling with these fundamental questions about existence, about the nature of reality, the mind-body problem, the limits of knowledge. the meaning of life.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
It is. And what's so amazing is that these ideas, conceived centuries ago, are still relevant and influential today. They've shaped how we think about ourselves, the world, and our place within it. These philosophers were true pioneers, mapping out the terrain of modern thought.
And while their answers might not always satisfy us, the questions they raised continue to challenge and inspire us. The quest for understanding goes on, and we're all part of that journey.
Exactly. It's an ongoing conversation, a search for meaning that spans cultures and centuries, and we get to be part of that dialogue, adding our own voices to the mix.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into 17th century metaphysics and epistemology, I want to leave you with this thought. Philosophy isn't just an academic exercise. It's not just about abstract theories or arcane arguments. It's about how we live our lives, how we make sense of the world, how we find meaning in the face of uncertainty and complexity.
It's about asking those big questions, challenging our assumptions, and embracing the mystery and wonder of existence.
It's about engaging with the great minds of the past and using their insights to illuminate our own journey of discovery. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper into the mysteries of the universe and the human mind.
The quest for knowledge is a lifelong adventure, and there are always new discoveries to be made.
And who knows, maybe one day your ideas will be part of this ongoing philosophical conversation, inspiring future generations to explore, question, and discover.
That's right. It's this really radical notion. It's almost like our minds are imposing a kind of grid, a framework, onto the raw data of experience. And that grid is what allows us to make sense of the world.
So instead of the world shaping our minds are shaping the world, at least the world as we experience it. It's like a giant mental Lego set where we're constantly taking those basic building blocks of perception and assembling them into our own unique models of reality.
That's a great analogy. And it gets to the heart of Kant's philosophy. He was saying that we can never truly know the world in itself, what he called the noumenal realm. All we have access to is the phenomenal realm, the world as it appears to us, already filtered and shaped by those mental categories.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it, to realize that there's always more to reality than we can possibly grasp.
It is humbling,
Yeah.
but it's also pretty exciting in a way, because it means there's always more to discover, more to learn, more to explore. Our knowledge is always going to be provisional, always open to revision.
Okay, so we've got this idea that our minds are actively shaping our perceptions of the world. But if that's the case, does that mean that everything is subjective? Is there no shared reality?
It's a really important question, and it gets to the heart of one of the big challenges in epistemology, the problem of objectivity. Kant believed that even though our perceptions are individually shaped by our minds, those shaping mechanisms, those categories of understanding, are universal.
Okay, so those mental lenses we were talking about, those are shared by all rational beings.
Right. It's like we're all running the same mental software. Even though the data we're processing, the specific experiences we're having, those are unique to each of us.
We're all playing the same video game, but with different controllers, seeing the game world from our own unique perspectives. But the rules of the game, the underlying code, that's the same for everyone.
Exactly. And that's what makes objective knowledge possible, according to Kant. It's that shared structure of reason that allows us to communicate, to build shared knowledge, to agree on certain truths about the world. It's what gives science its power and its universality.
Wow. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from Descartes' mind-body problem to Malebranche's vision of God to Spinoza's radical pantheism to Leibniz's intricate system of monads, and then to this incredible journey through epistemology with Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and now Kant.
It's pretty amazing to consider how much these thinkers, writing centuries ago, have shaped how we understand ourselves, the world, and what it even means to know something. They were truly pioneers, mapping out the terrain of modern thought.
And their work continues to challenge and provoke us, doesn't it? The questions they wrestled with, the mind-body problem, the existence of God, the limits of reason, the nature of reality, the meaning of life, those are still the big questions that we're grappling with today.
And that's what's so exciting about philosophy. It's not about finding easy answers. It's about learning to ask better questions, to think critically, to keep searching for deeper understanding.
It's about recognizing that there's always more to learn, always more to explore, always new perspectives to consider.
And it's about realizing that we're all part of this ongoing conversation, this quest for knowledge that has been going on for centuries.
Exactly. So, to wrap up our deep dive today, I just want to encourage you to carry that philosophical spirit with you. Keep asking those big questions, keep challenging your own assumptions, keep searching for those deeper levels of understanding.
And keep in mind that philosophy isn't just about abstract ideas. It's about how we live our lives, how we relate to the world, how we make sense of our own experience. It's about finding meaning in the midst of uncertainty and complexity.
It's about making the most of this incredible journey of discovery that we call life. So, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of 17th century philosophy. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those philosophical fires burning.